Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a series review that I'm very excited to do, and that is for The President's Daughter by Ellen Emerson White. I'm going to be reviewing the first three books in this series today: The President's Daughter, White House Autumn, and Long Live the Queen. There is also a fourth book that I will eventually be reviewing but won't be included today because I've been rereading the series and haven't reread that one yet. I kind of need to take a break between book three and book four, so today will just be the first three books. The first book in the series is, of course, The President's Daughter. This book covers Meg as her mother decides to run for president, runs for president, and then is elected, and Meg starts adjusting to the White House. I gave this book 5 stars. It's my least favorite of the series, and yet I still give it 5 stars because it's that wonderful. The series is so wonderful. But I do want to start with my negative for this book because it's like the biggest negative I have for the series overall happens here, and I just want to get it out of the way so I can just happily flail about everything else. I think my only negative for this one is the scope of the story seems much too wide for how long this book is. This book is under 300 pages, and yet it covers Meg's mother deciding she wants to run for president, running in the Democratic primary, getting the nomination and then running in the regular presidential election, getting elected, and then Meg adjusting to the White House. That's a lot for a book to cover in under 300 pages, and I do think it suffers a little bit for that. There's so much in the world that doesn't get explored and really could and should be explored because this book does feel like it's missing pieces that would be important. There's very little about the media in this book, even though her mother is running as the first woman to run for president. There's very little about the media in relation to Meg's family. There's very little about the actual running in the presidential election. There's just so much more that could have been included. And I think it's really noticeable in this book because it is included in the other books of the series, and this is the only book where it really has that problem. The other books either have a more limited scope or are significantly longer. And I just feel like this book is lacking a little bit for that. The first time I read it, I gave it 4 stars for that reason. And while my thoughts really haven't changed, it's just I love this book so much for what it is that although that is a problem, it doesn't take away from how much I adore this. I picked this up kind of randomly in Barnes& and Noble when I was like 15, and it didn't sound like my kind of thing because it is kind of, I don't want to say an absurdist storyline, but it is a little bit out there. It's a little bit over the top. It sounds a little over the top, but it isn't. And I think that's why I fell in love with this so much. The situation itself may be a little bit over the top, but nothing else about this is. The characters are so real and down to earth, and everything that happens is so small and detailed and realistic that it doesn't feel over the top in the slightest. It feels real. It hits me hard emotionally because these people feel like they're real people. I care about them. Ellen Emerson White takes this almost absurd sounding situation and makes it relatable. She makes it down to earth and realistic, and I love her for that. Another thing that I don't always appreciate in books is humor, and I do in this book. I love Meg's humor. Meg is very funny in a kind of dry, sarcastic kind of way. Not everyone always gets her humor, but it works well for me because of the way it exists in the story. I like her humor. It's kind of similar to my humor, and I find her quite hilarious. But also, it's the kind of jokes where they don't get explained. If you don't understand the joke, then it just continues on, and you get to live with not understanding the joke. I think one of the funniest things is at one point, her father says, "Hey, anyone want to watch the Celtics?" And they live in Boston. And Meg straight looks at him and says, "Gross, I hate hockey." And then just the scene ends, and that's it. And it's not explained, and if you don't get the joke, then like that's fine. It's not gonna like affect your enjoyment. It's just little oddball things that Meg says constantly throughout these books that I adore, and honestly, this is one of the very few books in the world that will make me laugh. And just beyond her humor, Meg is a fantastic main character. She's one of my favorite characters of all time, I think. She's highly intelligent, she's interesting, she's bratty, she's wonderful. I adore every second of her perspective. Even apart from the writing style and the story and the plot, Meg is what makes this series. Meg is amazing, and the way Ellen Emerson White captures her and her personality and her perception of things is unbelievable, honestly. She's such an insightful person, and White doesn't shy away from the politics of this book. It's not about the specific political policies, it's kind of about the backdrop of politics, about what it's like on the inside, how the media reacts to Meg, how Meg has to deal with the media, how she has to change the way she dresses and the way she talks and the jokes she makes and the people she hangs out with because of her mother's political position. And it's very nuanced and very interesting. And Meg herself is just so insightful and she understands so much politically, having grown up with her mother who has been in politics her entire life and just keeps rising through the political sphere. As a teenager, I had to work hard to keep up with Meg because Meg is smart and this book is smart and it never at any point dumbs it down for the reader. It's not difficult to understand. It's just one of those books that requires you put an effort to get anything out of it. And I love that. I loved having to work to keep up with Meg, and it is a little easier as an adult, but these books are still surprisingly dense, a little more dense than I would normally expect a young adult contemporary to be. And that's not a bad thing. That is very much a positive for me. It's not a book you're just going to sit back and enjoy. You have to work, you have to put in the effort. And when you do, it's so worthwhile and wonderful. I also think one of the great positives of this book is the family dynamic. There's a lot of focus on family, so if you're someone who's interested in reading about a close-knit family in a young adult book, definitely check this out. Meg is very close with her family. They're a very loving family, but they're also a realistic family. They're in this very difficult situation. There's a lot of pressure on them, so they have their fights, they have their disagreements, but at the end of the day, they're still a loving family. They make an effort to work through their problems together, and Meg has a great relationship with both of her brothers who are younger than her. They kind of have a bratty relationship, and they really express their love by teasing and bickering, which I think is wonderful because it's always done in such a loving way, even when they're being brats to each other, and I loved seeing it in this book. I thought it was fantastic. I love the family dynamic here because they do feel like a real family. They don't hate each other. There are no serious problems within the family. It's just they have their problems because they're put under a lot of pressure, under the focus of the media and the world, being that they are the first family. And then some small things that I wrote down that deserve to mention. The female president in this, Meg's mother, is unapologetically feminine. She prefers wearing dresses. She hates blazers. She'll take off her blazer and make a joke of it. She's vain about her appearance. She likes fashion. She likes wearing French fashion, even though as the American president, she's kind of pressured to wear more American fashion. And none of that matters to her presidency. None of it really affects her ability to do her job because it's completely irrelevant. That's just part of her. And it was nice to see a politician just be allowed to be so unapologetically feminine. I also enjoyed how much this book focuses on politics without ever coming across as preachy or condescending. Politics are very much an integral part of this book, but it never feels like I'm being taught politics. It just feels like this is part of Meg's life. It's part of her story, and so we're reading it. It's not trying to teach you a lesson. And I really enjoyed that Meg's family isn't touchy-feely. That's a very small thing, but it's nice to see a loving, caring family who isn't super touchy-feely. Because I feel like in fiction, that's a little bit of a rare thing. If they're not touchy-feely, then they're like a cold, unfeeling family. And they're not in this book. They just happen to be not super touchy-feely people. 5 stars. This book is wonderful. My least favorite of the series, but still so wonderful. And I love it. And this almost had me tearing up, not because it's sad, it's more of a heartwarming book than the rest of the series. Nothing really bad happens in this, but just being so excited to reread it, and it's one of my favorites. It will always be a favorite to me. The second book in the series is White House Autumn. This focuses on an assassination attempt of Meg's mother. These books are kind of episodic. They do happen chronologically, and you do need to read them in order, but they don't continue any plot lines until you get to the 4th book. They're all about very separate events. I gave this book 5 stars as well. They're all 5-star reads for me, so I love them. This book, while shorter, does not have the same issue with scope. It's only 230 pages, where the first one is just shy of 300, but this focuses on a much more limited event. Because of that, it only takes place over a couple of weeks, where the first book takes place over many months. I do think that made this book better for me because it didn't feel rushed at any point. It didn't feel like it was skipping anything important. It covered everything I wanted it to cover. It explored the world in depth, and I love that. There was a lot more focus on the media in this book, and I think that's something that Ellen Emerson White does so well. Just the way Meg has to deal with the media. At one point, a picture is taken of her crying, and it makes its way into a magazine. And she talks about how that's probably going to be like one of the best pictures of the year. The president's daughter having a private moment of grief. And Meg's like, well, it's not private anymore. And she says, she talks about how powerful that picture would be to her if it had been anyone but her. And I love that. Most of my positives are the same, so I'm not gonna like repeat things that are the same from book to book. Of course, her family relationship is still wonderful. It's still the same. Like, I still love it. But I don't need to go over these things twice in this video, or it would be very, very long. One thing that is new is Meg's romantic relationship. She gets a boyfriend in this book, and it's so well done. I love just seeing healthy relationships in young adult, and this is one of the healthiest. She frequently refers to him as her friend, not because she's trying to friend zone him or anything, or she's trying to undermine their romantic relationship. It's just that she cares about his friendship more than anything else. That's what's important to her. At one point, she talks to her father, and he asks about her boyfriend Josh, and Meg mentions that he's her closest friend there, and then says, "Is that what it was like for you and Mom?" And her father was like, "Yes." And it's just so healthy and like heartwarming and wonderful. This book is also fairly sad. I didn't openly cry, but I did tear up at certain points. Ellen Emerson White does such a wonderful job of keeping everything so small and so detailed because it's really when you make the worlds and your stories small that they touch the reader. If something big and horrifying happens, of course that's sad, but it hits so much closer to home when it is something small and kind of seemingly insignificant. I think the point I teared up in this was when Meg was talking to her English teacher about her home life and inwardly kind of wishing that her mother had been an English teacher and that she didn't have to go through traumatic things like people trying to assassinate her mother. And it was really touching and really emotional for me. I think it was just wonderfully done. Another thing that's explored a lot more in this book are Meg's flaws. They were, of course, apparent in the first book, but they're openly discussed in this. She has a tendency to be kind of standoffish and assume the worst from people who are close to her, who she really shouldn't assume the worst from. And her best friend actually calls her out on this. There's no great character development. It's not that Meg completely does a turnabout and changes as a person, but the next time she finds herself being standoffish and alienating someone that she shouldn't really be alienating, she actually stops herself and realizes what she's doing and lets the other person explain. And I thought that was wonderful. It's just such a healthy thing to showcase. She doesn't need some great dramatic character development. She's not a bad person. She just kind of didn't realize she was being a jerk. And then someone told her she was being a jerk and she actively made an attempt to be less of a jerk. And it's one of those small things. It's just like, it's wonderful to read because it doesn't have to be this big dramatic moment. It's just the small things that happen to people in everyday life. One thing that is not a negative for me, but I think could be a negative for some other people, is that there's almost no arc to any of these books. It's kind of more of a day in the life type story. It just happens to be a day in the life of a very exciting person. And I enjoy that. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but there are a great many exciting things that happen in these books. It's never boring. It's never just covering an average person's life. Meg is clearly not an average person. Her mother is the President of the United States. There's an assassination attempt. She's going through all these things. It's just, there's no specific story arc. There's no dramatic climax at the end. It's just, this is her life. This is what it's like to be Meg Powers. I love that. I think it's one of the many wonderful things about this series, but I know that isn't everyone's cup of tea. A final flailing bit for this book before I move on to the third and final book that I'll be doing for this review. I love the way White captures politics, and I talked a little bit about this before, but I do want to get more in depth on that. Meg is only politically adjacent. She's not actively involved in politics. She's the president's daughter. It would have been so easy for White to just kind of disregard politics and write it out of the book as much as possible, but she doesn't. She kind of embraces it. Meg is smart, and it wouldn't be realistic for her character to ignore politics when she's surrounded by it as much as she is. She's not actively involved. She's never actively involved, but she's very aware of what's going on. She's very insightful as to why things are happening around her. And I think it's really interesting to learn about politics from an insider, especially someone who's not doing it for any personal gain. And it could have been so easy to fall into just cheap propaganda because I know White is very political, but it doesn't. It's not really about the specific political views, but more about the way everything they do carries some kind of political weight. Like, obviously, her mother is the president, so for her, it is more about the political views. But for Meg, it's not. Meg doesn't necessarily share her political views all the time, but the way she dresses matters because her picture is going to be in the newspaper. And people are going to infer her political views from the way she's dressing. People are going to infer things about her and infer things about her mother. So what she does matters in a political sense, and it's so well done. There's so much nuance. And Meg is so intelligent that it really is interesting to learn about the nuance because it's not anything that I would have thought about myself. The only negative that I could possibly come up with is a very small thing, and it is that the writing can be a little bit generic at times. For example, at one point, Meg is sitting in her class taking a test that she didn't prepare for, and she's like, I wish anything would happen to get me out of this. And then someone comes into the class and gives her bad news, and it's like, oh, of course that's how that happened. It wasn't a major thing. It was just like, there were a couple of points in this book where I was like, oh, of course, that's not a very unique way to tell this. But it was fine. It's not really about the way things happen, it's more about Meg and her character and her perception of the world, so it doesn't really impact my enjoyment at all. It was just a very little thing that I noticed, and I didn't want this to be entirely biased and positive. And then we move on to Long Live the Queen, which is book 3, and of these 3 books, my favorite. The series just gets better and better with every additional book. In this book, Meg is kidnapped by terrorists, and I don't want to go too much in depth because I don't want to give anyone spoilers and ruin the book, but honestly with this series, like I just said, it's not about what happens. It's more about Meg's character and her development and how she deals with everything. So if you are particularly spoiler squeamish, then I don't want to say click off because like these are wonderful and I want to convince people to read them, but I probably will be talking about some things that if you are very, very spoiler squeamish, you might not enjoy. But I don't think they would impact your enjoyment of this book if you aren't. I have so many feelings about this book. I was not expecting this to hit me as hard emotionally as it did. It's just over 300 pages, and I'm pretty sure I cried for about 250 of those pages. I started around page 70 or 80, and then I just didn't stop for the rest of the book. It was so wonderful and so sad. And I cried after I read it, and I read this in one sitting. I was taking my time with the previous 2 books. It took me like a month to read both of them just because I was savoring them. And this I read mostly in one sitting. I couldn't put it down. It was just one of those books I was so engrossed in. I never wanted it to end. It's not so much that it's a profoundly sad situation. It is. Meg is kidnapped by terrorists. That's like incredibly traumatic. It's the way it's written. It wasn't the kidnapping part that had me tearing up, although that was absolutely terrifying to read. It happened so fast and just everything about it was just violent and terrifying and so well written. But it's the way White writes about the small things. There's one moment in an ambulance where the doctor asks when the last time she's eaten, and she says breakfast, and they're like, what, you ate breakfast today? And she's like, no, before school. And someone's like, you haven't eaten in however long? And it was just like, that was when I started crying, and then I didn't stop. It was just like, because it was like such small things and the way it was written, and it hit me so hard emotionally. It's not hard to make me cry in books. I do tear up on a fairly regular basis, but I don't normally just sob for entire books like I did with this one. And this made my chest hurt. Like, when you're so sad, it's so emotional that like you get that tightness in your chest. That's how I was feeling for this book, and that's not something that I feel frequently when it comes to the books I'm reading. This is up there with A Mango-Shaped Space and how much it made me cry. My absolute favorite thing about this is how much it focuses on after the trauma. Yes, the trauma itself is important and a major part of the story, but most of it happens after the trauma. It happens when Meg is trying to heal and when Meg is trying to recover from everything she went through. And Meg learning that she might not ever fully recover from certain things. And that's so just realistic, and that's what I'm interested in books. This isn't trying to be a thriller. It's not trying to be an action, mystery, spy, terrorist novel. It's a YA contemporary about this girl who had something horrible and traumatic happen to her. And it's a lot about her healing and recovery, and I love that. I love that so much. That's what I'm interested in when it comes to books. And the fact that this took place mostly after was just amazing to me. And it was so interesting and so well done and so detailed when it comes to Meg's psychology and her medical issues. The only thing I didn't really enjoy about this book, which kind of surprised me, was the time when Meg was actually kidnapped, when she was held prisoner by the terrorists. That I found a little bit boring, and for a while I thought I might give the book 4 stars for that. But it didn't last very long. It wasn't a big portion of the book. And I think if it had been a big portion of this book, it would have knocked it down a star because I just didn't enjoy that. And I don't know if it had anything to do with the way White wrote it, or if it was more just I personally don't enjoy things like that. I talk so much about how this book feels real and down to earth and everything is so small and significant. But that part was the only part that really didn't feel that way to me. In this whole series, like all 4 books, that was the only section where I didn't get that feeling from it. And that did kind of disappoint me, but it was such a small section, and the rest of it was so amazing and so incredibly intense that it didn't really impact my overall rating or enjoyment of this book. It was just kind of something that I got through in order to read the part of the book that actually mattered to me. And that was wonderful. I can't really tell you how much I love this book. I cannot express how much I love it because it's so wonderful. And even through everything traumatic and sad that's happening, everything else that I enjoy is the same. Meg still has her same sense of humor. Of course, she changes as a character. She gets a lot darker. She has more gravitas, but she's still the same. She has the same loving family. It's just the issues they're dealing with are a lot more serious now than they were in book 1. And I love it. I never see anyone talking about these books, and they're so wonderful. They're my favorite series. Ellen Emerson White is one of my favorite authors, and I cannot recommend her enough. Like, all I want is to convince people to read these books because they're so wonderful and they're so amazing, and they're just honestly my favorite thing ever. And I would love for just everyone else in the world to read these and become enlightened to how wonderful Ellen Emerson White is and how wonderful this series is. I will eventually do a review for book 4, Long May She Reign, in the series, but I wanted to do a review on the first 3 first, just because these 3 were published in the 80s, and then book 4 was published in the 2000s, and those 3 were republished, so I thought it was kind of fitting to just review the first 3 first and then go do the 4th one later. And also I needed to take a break because Long Live the Queen was literally so intense that I could not continue on in the series after that. I needed some time to heal my soul because that book was emotionally traumatic to read in the best way possible, but it was still very difficult. Let me know down below if you read these books and what you thought of them, or if they sound interesting to you, because I would really just love to talk more people into reading them because they're so worthwhile and so wonderful, and I have such great love for this series, but no one else ever seems to have heard of them. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.